All right, so to begin the session, I would like to open up the space, really bring in the site safety in so everyone knows that this is an open space. And I want to ask the question for you guys in terms of what comes to mind, what's your definition when you think of resilience? So when we actually do the research and we look and we actually create and we talk to companies and we build in terms of what resilience is, the working definition that we have for resilience is actually the ability to bounce back, but it's the ability to bounce back in a healthy and sustainable way. So it's, of course, as people said, adapting to any pressures, adapting to change, making sure that you can recover, being flexible and stuff like that, using your resources and really learning how to help yourself and understand your capacity over time so that you can bounce back in that healthy and sustainable way. And we say that because a lot of times what happens is people think that resilience is just going. You just keep going. And people think it's, you never feel stressed or overwhelmed, or that you're constantly remaining positive, or you're ignoring your emotions, you're ignoring your mental cues that are telling you that something isn't right, that I'm just trying to power through, or you're tolerating unhealthy conditions and you're working harder with fewer resources and you're trying to hold the load on all by yourself. So those things aren't resilience. A lot of times the human body, we honestly cannot just keep going, because the body and the brain will force you to stop if you don't stop. So when we're talking about resilience, it is that ability to bounce back, but it's doing that in a healthy and sustainable way. So throughout the session, we'll talk a little bit about how to actually do that in a healthy and sustainable way. But the first thing that I think is very interesting to talk about is resilience and the brain. So I always think the brain stuff is always the most fascinating thing. And this is what I like to call your resilience dream team. And so there are four main members of the team, I would say. So that's the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the insula. So you may have heard about some of these brain areas before, but I really love talking about them, is because it makes things so tangible, and it does make so much sense when you kind of start going through and thinking about the brain areas. So the first member of the team is the amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of that emotional response area of the brain. So we like to call it almost like it's your threat response. It's always scanning the environment. So it's almost like a smoke detector, if you think about it, of the brain. So it can tell when there's smoke, so it signals to the body immediately that something's going on. So when the amygdala is working well, that tells us there's a threat in the environment. You need to run, all those things. That's what's happening in the amygdala. So that's happening in that area of the brain. And then the other part of the brain that's very interesting we like to look at is the prefrontal cortex. And we like to call the prefrontal cortex the CEO of the brain. So that's like the team captain of this resilience dream team. And the prefrontal cortex is that high level thinking. So, the high level critical decision making, all those things are happening in the prefrontal cortex. And you'll see that the medial prefrontal cortex there, that actually regulates the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex is very much, doing a lot of that high level thinking. And if you see where it's at as well, it's actually one of the newer parts of the brain. When we look at evolution and looking at the brain over time, that's actually one of the newer areas of the brain. And you can see some of these that are more concentrated down there. Those are some of the older parts of the brain. That's why places like the amygdala react to stimuli, react to the environment, because it's, that part of the brain. And the other part of the dream team is the hippocampus. So that part of the brain is like the historian. So it gives context to the memories that you have. It's remembering things when things happen. The hippocampus is there, really gathering all that information and remembering it and making sense of it when something is occurring. And then the insula is about interoception. So that's understanding what's going on with your own body. So, those fluttery feelings in your stomach, or when your heart rate starts going up and you start getting those feelings, the insula is what's being activated, and that's that self-awareness comes into play, where it's that mind body connection. The insula is actually what's activating at that time. So when those areas are working well, you can kind of see how the system works. The amygdala is telling you something's wrong, you're stressed, you're doing all these things. The prefrontal cortex comes into play, and it's just like, oh, let's see what's going on. The hippocampus makes sense of it, and the insula is looking at the body to kind of make sense also in terms of what you're feeling and where you're at that point in time. So that's the system when it's working well. The prefrontal cortex is in control, and it's making sure everything is going as it should be. However, not all the time this system works how it should be, because sometimes the amygdala actually takes over, right? So I put this slide in here because I always think it's a good kind of comparison, and you'll see unstressed brain versus the stressed brain. I like to call the other side more the regulated brain versus the stressed brain, because when the brain is regulated, the prefrontal cortex, as we said, it's that team captain. It's, making sure that the team is running fine. It's making sure that, it has tight control of your thoughts and emotions, because as we say, that amygdala is there and it's ready to go. But when you're stressed and when you have chronic stress, the amygdala takes over, and we like to call that an amygdala hijack. And what happens is your body is constantly thinking that something's going on, something's wrong. As I said, it's like a smoke detector, so it just becomes more and more sensitive. And think about it, it's like every smoke, steam, everything, the alarm is blaring, right? And of course, that makes sense for us to have that amygdala going when you are maybe like a lion comes into the room. But if every time you have a Slack message, every time a Teams call happens, every time something occurs, your amygdala starts signaling to your body that you're in danger, then that would lead you to just constantly having that feeling of stress, constantly having those feelings of anxiety, what's going on. You always think that something's wrong. And it's very interesting because the amygdala could actually grow. And when the amygdala is taking over, it actually starts taking resources away from the prefrontal cortex, right? Because the amygdala is now activating your cortisol levels, which some people may have heard of before. And what the amygdala does is it floods the body with cortisol. It starts pumping all the blood away from the prefrontal cortex, away from that high level of thinking, pumps it into the body, and then the prefrontal cortex is no longer in charge. The amygdala is in charge. Sometimes people's minds go blank. That's that draining feeling sometimes when people get very angry, or you feel very nervous and you go into that fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what's happening. The amygdala has taken over, and that's you're in that situation, right? And so you can see how then you need to have that recovery process happening. So you can have the pressure, have that stress response, you do something about it. Either you stop, you pause, or that stress goes away and then you recover. Remember, we talked about that bouncing back, but doing it in a healthy and safe way. So that's you recovering. But when you don't have sufficient recovery, or you don't have a proper recovery system in place, then you have that pressure. You get that stress response, more pressure gets added, and then the amygdala is continuously being activated and continuously going and going and going. And you could just imagine how much stress that puts on the body. The body is constantly flooding your system with cortisol. You're constantly in this hyper vigilant, way. And that is that persistent, that's where you get that feeling of exhaustion, and you're physically and mentally drained because your body is actually continuously preparing itself to fight. You're not fighting anything. It's just a team call. It's just a manager meeting. It's just a project. And all of a sudden your body thinks every little thing is something that's going to harm you, and it's actually going to cause you physical pain. The brain can actually make you experience physical pain from being under stress so much. And that could, of course, reduce your creativity, reduce your concentration, because as we said, that prefrontal cortex, where things like concentration and creativity takes place, is now putting its resources elsewhere. So now you can't concentrate, you can't sleep as well, because cortisol is also important for the sleep wake cycle, right? So in the night, your cortisol level goes down. That's why people say don't look at your phone and do all these things so you can reduce your cortisol level. And that's what actually puts you to sleep. And then it spikes when it needs you to wake up, right? But if it's constantly spiked, then the body is trying to figure out what's going on. Are you in danger? Do I need to be awake? Can I sleep? Am I actually safe when I sleep? You're not actually going to be able to sleep well. So it's going to constantly disrupt your sleep. It's going to make you very irritable if you don't sleep. It's going to make you unstable, and you're going to feel that constant sense of being alert, right? But it's also, on the other hand, could also reduce your motivation. So now you're feeling like you're unmotivated because everything feels taxing and draining. You can't switch off, you can't relax. Your system is constantly telling you something's wrong, and you're tense. And then that feeling of withdrawal and numbness comes in because the brain cannot sustain being in that stress response so much. So then it's now going to shut itself down to actually be able to sustain you, staying awake, moving on, because it can't handle that pressure so much over time. And that's what we like to call burnout. When you reach that stage, that's burnout. And we like to separate this with like the understanding of what stress is versus what burnout is, because a lot of times some stress is good, but it's almost like it's on a continuum where there's stress and burnout. And a lot of times people don't know when they're kind of stressed a little bit or when they've fully found themselves in burnout, right? And that feeling of stress, when we're thinking about it, is of course feeling overwhelmed, anxious, you're feeling, very hyperactive, and you do still care about what you're doing, you're having that urgency, and you do care about what's coming out. And you may feel some tension, but you may still have that energy to go forward and push through. But burnout, on the other hand, feels like this heavy weight is on you. It's that emptiness and numbness and a very deep sense of hopelessness, right? And you start caring. A lot of people, when we speak to them about burnout, they almost say that it feels like an out of body experience. So you feel very detached from everything, and you develop a very cynical view, because remember, the brain and the body is telling itself now you're constantly in danger, and then you're feeling like, well, nothing I do matters because I'm now in the cycle of not being able to sleep. So it becomes a very fatigued life to live. You lose that motivation and you feel very withdrawn. Even when you try to sleep or you try to take a break, you find yourself feeling like you have no energy at all. And so if you are finding yourself in that burnout category, you start seeing symptoms of that, that's when you know that you're heading towards burnout. And that's when you really have to stop for a second and ask yourself, am I just stressed, or is this becoming something a little bit more? So it's always good to really understand the difference between stress and burnout, because we don't want to ever really heading towards burnout. You can be a little stressed, of course, but as we said, it's that active, that good recovery, healthy recovery, sustainable recovery that we actually want, right? And so when we think about why this matters for you, when you look at the research, people that work in the ocean, climate, environmental space actually carry a very distinct psychological burden. And it's very interesting when you look at the research, because a lot of people enter the climate, the ocean space because they love it. They really love it. When we look at the interviews with people in the environmental space, they're very passionate. They really care about the ocean. They really care about the environment, and they have a vision and they have a way that things could be fixed. They're seeing things go wrong and they're saying, well, we all have to live in this. We have to make sure that this environment is good for the future that's coming, and you can see all the animals, all those things. So it's a very distinct thing to be in this space. However, what we see is that because of this emotional connection, then you're more likely to actually be in a place where you can get burnt out very easily, because you experience things like climate grief. And that's like you're sitting down and you're almost watching the world burn around you, and you're feeling that kind of anxiety and hopelessness because you can't do anything. You have that frustration and sadness because you know how things could be fixed. You know a little bit more about what the policies are saying, what's going on, and you're feeling this moral distress because you want to help, but you're feeling powerless, and you're feeling like you see the policies, you see all these things that are going on and being involved, and you're just telling yourself that it could just be easily fixed. Why don't we just do this? You know the impacts that it's going to have. So you're very much in that space where you feel that burden and you feel it very heavily, and it's attached to what you're doing. And so when we look a little further into now the numbers, we see a lot of times people working in the kind of marine and conservation space feeling very anxious, especially the people that just joined. They're feeling high anxiety, they're feeling burnout, 50% of them. So they're coming in with this hopeful, outlook, and then they're quickly becoming burnt out, quickly becoming depressed, and quickly becoming very anxious. And then we're also seeing mental exhaustion, having that mental drain that's being there, and really feeling the pressure and a lot of stress associated with working in this space. So this is not, of course, to deter you from working in this space or doing what you love, but it is a reminder that you do have this connection, you do have a lot of emotional investment going on, and that could lead you very quickly to burnout, very quickly to stress. So it's a good thing to keep in mind when we're going through and building your kind of resilience, that you are a little bit more at risk than some other sectors that we have done research on and that we've looked into. And it's very interesting. I do like this slide, and we tend to say this a lot of times about the path to hell, or a path to hell is paved with good intentions. And a lot of times when we're looking at companies that see like that the employees are stressed and all these things, they're thinking, oh, but we don't understand why, like what's going on. Even in some small teams, they're trying to figure out why our resilience is so low. Everyone is very passionate, they want to do these things, but the team isn't very resilient. And what we're seeing is that a lot of times you have all these good intentions, whether it's for yourself or a manager for a team. A lot of times there's this push, this continuous that perseverance, but it's almost a toxic perseverance where they just want to go. And one example of this is very interesting. There was a bank where they had this new theme that they wanted to come in, a new policy where it was called Going for Great. And so they wanted, employees to open new cards, and they wanted, it was supposed to be a very fun thing to get people involved in and have healthy competition and have people really push their limits to try and get, as many people to sign up for different cards as possible. But what they started finding was that the competitive nature of it started getting linked to promotions. It now started being where people started feeling the pressure too much. People started getting more sick. People started taking sick leave. People started leaving the company. And unfortunately, people also started forging documents, actually started creating fake accounts because of this toxic cycle of pushing people way past their limits to try and go for great. And so that's a good cautionary tale sometimes, and a good kind of way of thinking about psych safety and how it reacts with resilience as well. You have to have a safe space to talk about things, to be able to, you yourself have to create a safe space for yourself and your team to be able to talk about things, to be able to have resilience going around. So that's a good thing to kind of remember, that sometimes you yourself could be making your own situation and really impacting your own resilience. So that's something to think about. So now we're going into a bit of really understanding your own personal stress signals. When we look at the body and we're recognizing your own personal stress signals, a lot of times this looks like that muscle tension. So remember, we talked about that cortisol flooding the muscles to help you, run if there was a tiger in the room. But over time, you can see sometimes a lot of people have the stress in their shoulders, or they have their stress, they walk around with their fist, really tight, or you see the furrow, their brow, where they're like this all the time. That's muscle tension, and that tension over time can cause things like headaches. That constant pressure of you going like that causes headaches. That can also have you having that shallow breathing, because if you think about when your heart starts racing and stuff like that, sometimes it could get a little bit hard to breathe. So when you're very stressed, do you find sometimes that you're very shallow, having that shallow breath? Or someone in the chat said, I just saw that, thank you, how you feel that fatigue. So you feel like you don't know, you can't move, it's really hard to get up in the morning. Or do you find that it's very hard to fall asleep? As we said, that cortisol could have you sleeping but not sleeping well. So you're not going into a deep sleep, you're always kind of sleeping in a way that if something were to happen, you fly out of your sleep. So that's where sometimes you get that fatigue, or sometimes you get where you can't sleep, you're only sleeping for a few hours and waking up. That's that sleep disruption that's going on. And it could also cause digestive discomfort as well, because when the body is, putting you in that fight or freeze, or if you are feeling that butterfly feeling in your stomach, sometimes when the system is going awry, that insula starts going haywire. So your body can't even read what signals are being given, because you're getting stress signals when you're not even really that stressed. You're putting yourself in a panic when you're not really in a situation where you need to run. So then you start getting digestive discomfort as well. So start thinking about the ways that maybe it shows up in your body. And even if there's not some hair, maybe start thinking about what else happens in your body when you are starting to feel stressed. And then when we think about in your thoughts as well, so are you someone where when you get very stressed that you feel like your thoughts start racing, or you find it very hard to really narrow in? Remember, we talked about that prefrontal cortex, that where you can't concentrate. Or is it that you start catastrophizing? So you're walking around thinking like, oh my gosh, I was supposed to do this thing, this project, or I needed to join that meeting and I wasn't able to join that meeting, I'm going to get fired. All these things start going on. You start making it bigger and bigger and bigger in your mind, and overthinking and catastrophizing everything. Or do you find that you have that perfectionist tendency going on? So sometimes when people get stressed, they start feeling like they can't control anything. And sometimes that perfectionism comes in because that is something that you feel like maybe you can control. So you start looking at some very tiny details, and you start looking at every little detail that's around, because your brain is trying to hold on to something that it could control. So sometimes that's why that perfectionism comes down. Or you can start feeling like everything is up to you, like you have to be the one in control of everything. On the flip side, some people feel like nothing I do matters. So that's starting to feel that feeling of despair, and I don't know, I can't do anything right. So what's the point of doing anything? So think about maybe where your stress appears in your thoughts. And then when we look at emotions, so of course, some of these are very that we know a lot of times when people get stressed, sometimes people get irritable, there's that anxiety, or sometimes people get very angry because they feel like they're on that lack of sleep, or they're on edge all the time, so they get very snappy. Or sometimes people feel very guilty, so they start feeling very sad because they start feeling like, I'm not doing my job well, I'm supposed to be helping the environment, I'm supposed to be doing all these things. And so they start feeling very guilty because they feel like they can't do those things, and they start feeling that helplessness and that numbness. So that's the kind of stress appearing in the emotions. And then when we think about your behavior as well, so for some people, when they feel stressed, they start working longer hours. So they start pushing themselves even more, because they start feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to just continue going and going and going. And then they start skipping breaks. But for some people also, they find that there's difficulties actually doing tasks, so they start avoiding them. So some people just go, go, go. Some people start avoiding them, or they start continuously checking to see what's going on. They're checking their emails, they're checking their messages constantly. Or some people start withdrawing or reacting very quickly to what's going on. So start thinking about where for yourself and your behavior, those stress signals start appearing. And then lastly, when we start thinking about your connection to the work that you're doing, for some people, when they start feeling very stressed, they start losing motivation. They start feeling very cynical. What's the point of what I'm doing? I'm not able to change anything. We're not even doing anything. What's the point? So they have that cynicism starting to come in. They start feeling ineffective. Some people start taking every setback personally. So if someone gives them feedback, they take it very personally as a personal attack in terms of, but not looking at it as it's just a job that you're doing, rather you have failed in something, right? Or, they're being unable to leave a project or losing sight of the progress that they've actually made. So sometimes people have made so much progress, they've done a lot, but they feel like I haven't even done anything worthwhile, right? So really start thinking about for yourself when you're thinking about the work that you're doing, how does stress appear for you? And so as we go on to the next set of slides, we'll start looking at the toolkit that you can start building for yourself for resilience. And when we're looking at those, think about these stress signals that you've put for yourself, and then think about what areas in the toolkit can actually work the best for you in the different ways that you can kind of put into play there. So I'll take you nicely into the toolkit. So these resilience toolkit, there's 8 tools that I'm going to be giving you today, and the way you can use it, some of them there's questions involved in them. So some of them are questions you can ask yourself, maybe have them, you can write them down on your notebook. If you journal, you can also do those things as well. So this is really for yourself, and you can maybe make a note of different things that maybe pop out to you that you feel could really help yourself as you go forward. So some of these will, of course, be things that you may have heard before, but it's always good to bring them up and really think about them in connection, as I said, to those stress responses that you've put in there. So the first thing is boundaries around responsibility, right? So a lot of times we tend to feel like we're responsible for everything, or, for the people who get stressed and that perfectionism comes in. Sometimes you do need to have those responsibilities around, boundaries. Boundaries around the responsibilities that you hold. So some questions that you can ask yourself is in terms of, is this actually urgent? So the responsibility that you have, sometimes you feel like, oh, I need to do everything right now, and everything is urgent and everything is extremely important. Sometimes you need to take a step back and really look at your list and say, what can I prioritize, right? But also, am I the right person to be doing all these tasks? Is there something I can share with a member of my team? Is there something that's there that I can, share responsibilities as well? And also, what's the reasonable standard here? Like, am I being reasonable with myself in terms of what I'm doing, and is this my sole responsibility, right? And then, of course, is there support that I can get from other people? So these are questions that you can ask yourself when you're building these boundaries around the responsibility that you hold. And then the second thing on the toolkit, that's called pause, breathe, and broaden, right? So when you find yourself starting to feel very stressed, sometimes pausing, breathing, and really looking around at what's going on could be very helpful. So there are different types of breathing techniques, and there are ones that, of course, that people like, some people like other ones. So there's like the box breathing, which is 4 in, hold for 4, out for 4, and then you pause again for 4. And then you do that until you start feeling your heart rate going down. So that's really about calming that amygdala down, doing that box breathing. Or some people do 2 in and 1 out. And that's very reminiscent. If you think about when someone's giving birth, we go, whew, whew. That's actually a physiological sigh, and that helps your lungs, that helps you really calm your nervous system down as well. So that's why they do that breathing when people are giving birth as well. So when you're going through and you're feeling stressed, sometimes it's good to stop and breathe. But also when we say broaden, in terms of, What am I noticing? What does my body need in this moment? Do I need to stop? Do I need to ask for help? What do I need? And what's some of the useful next steps that's there? And what am I missing? So really stop and broaden and like look at the panorama. We like to say, look outside, look at the panorama and think about the different things and broaden your perspective, because sometimes we can get very laser focused in when we are feeling very stressed. Another thing that you could do as well, that I find very interesting, is making a transition ritual, right? So that signals to your brain that your work day has ended. So a lot of times, some people have work on their phone. Back in the day, we could have left work and no one could have really called you and messaged you and pinged you continuously. But nowadays, we can have everything on your watch, on your phone, right, very easily accessible. So it's really about creating that transition routine so that you stop and okay, I'm stopping now. Whether it's closing your laptop, whether it's, writing down things. What am I going to do tomorrow? My to-do list for tomorrow is XYZ. You close the laptop and then that's your transition ritual. So you've created something to tell your brain, okay, it's time for me to stop working. Or for some people, it could be stopping going to the gym, and they go to the gym and they come back and they know after that there's no more working. Or it could be as simple as turning off your notifications at a certain point in time so that okay, that's it. I need to sleep. I'm going to transition out from the working me and I'm going to stop. And of course, as I said earlier, when you think about working in conservation, working in the environment, sometimes you need that, okay, I'm going to stop now and I'm going to just listen to music, do something else, because you look at the news, you look at all these things that brings back up the stress for you. So sometimes you need to transition out from that and separate it and be like, okay, this is my time to relax. I'm not engaging with any of these things. And you create a ritual there so you can transition out of that headspace. So that's something that you could do. Another thing is the control, influence, and concern. So these are questions you can ask yourself in terms of, what am I actually in control of? Because sometimes we think, okay, I have all these things to do. I need to do X, Y, and Z. But sometimes we need to stop and be like, I'm actually only in control of this small part of this project. This is what I actually have influence over. And what concerns me is X, Y, and Z. That's the way you look at things. So you can write down the words control, influence, concern when you're feeling very stressed, and write down, I'm in control of X. I'm influencing X. What concerns me, maybe X, Y, and Z. And you list it out, and that helps you kind of bring your brain back into what you're doing. So that's what we do. You can list those things out and do that as a kind of resilience tool for yourself. And then the other 4 we have is the social support and collection resilience. So social support is very, very important when we're thinking about resilience, because of course, family, friends, all these things are part of our support system, and our support system helps us be resilient. So just going out and hanging out with friends for a little bit, that can actually help your resilience. And we see that over time, that makes a very big impact when you're thinking about resilience. So, having someone where you can speak to them honestly, maybe someone who's within your field that understands the work that you're doing, even coming to these clusters and joining these things, that's your social support network, where people can understand you. You're coming from different regions, you have different ideas, but you're coming together and you all have that support. And so you can build, in like a session like this, collective resilience, where you can check in on each other, you can check in to see how people are doing, all these things, so that you're building a community that is resilient. So that can help you really move forward when you're feeling extremely stressed, if you feel like you're heading towards burnout. And then the other thing you can do is really connect with the purpose, and connect and the purpose and the progress that you've had going forward. So I know sometimes you can be very stressed, and sometimes going to the beach can help you. That could be a very good thing, because you're connecting with actually what you want to do. You're connecting with the ocean. You feel connected to that. So doing simple things like that could be what connects you. Or you can ask yourself the questions in terms of, what matters to me? What am I contributing? How realistic is what I'm doing? What progress have I made then what can I be a part of that's larger than myself? So you're reconnecting, going to conferences, really hearing talks and works that people are doing. That reconnects you into the purpose of why you're here, why you're doing what you're doing. And that could take you out of that stress cycle that's in there. And then the other thing is micro recoveries. So, when we talked about on that line of, you feel stressed, you have that recovery in there. You can also have micro recoveries. So throughout the day, if you are starting to feel yourself get stressed, you can have a walk outside, look outside, say, okay, I'm going to take a quick break. Of course, moving your body has been found to really help you, looking away from your screen, having your lunch away from your desk. All these things are little micro recoveries that you can put in place to really help you. There's one company that we work with where they do a meeting is always 5 or 10, like after each meeting, they put another meeting 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. So there's always a 5 to 10 minute gap between each meeting. And that's just so they can stand up for a little bit, that they could look around for a little bit, so that they have those little micro recoveries in place. So you can try doing something like that for yourself. And then the last thing is habit stacking. So it's really interesting. There's a book that goes through like a bunch of different habits that you can stack together. But what habit stacking really is about is connecting these little micro recoveries or little habits that you can put into things that you do automatically, right? So if you're opening your laptop and then you do the box breathing when you're doing that. So you really start your day and be like, okay, I have to open this laptop, you box breathe. If you feel yourself getting very stressed, you close the laptop, you can do box breathing, and then you open it back up. So you're doing things that you will do automatically, and then you're putting habits in place in there. For example, as I talked about that walk, we've also found things like dark chocolate could be very helpful for your resilience. So you can take a walk, have a bit of dark chocolate, listen to music, and that could be part of your recovery system, or that could be part of your, end of day. This is where I'm going to stop your ritual where you're like, I'm going to stop working now. I'm going to take my walk, have my dark chocolate, listen to my music, and then I come back and then I know I'm going to start winding down for the day. So you can do little habits that you can really stack together to help yourself build that resilience. So yes, there's different ways that you can do that. So that actually takes me very nicely to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.